So we all know that the best sermons usually have at least one good story, right? Usually this is a way to open up the sermon, or maybe something to try about halfway through your sermon when folks are starting to drift off a little bit. Good sermons might also offer us various interpretations of a passage and explore its deeper layers of meaning. And then there are times when the power is found in the unapologetic clarity of the text. This is one of those sermons where I can do little to add to the clarity of the message just as it is. And certainly, I can come up with no better story, than this story. I also have to confess that this story, the story of David and Mephibosheth, I'm going to mispronounce it a bunch of times. I appreciate your grace. This story of David and Mephibosheth is one of my very favorite Bible stories. It's like a dream come true to have children saying it. Have they ever said it before? Have you ever heard it before? No, probably not. I want it to be much more well known, and I've always wondered, why do we all know the story of David and Goliath, but mostly none of us have ever heard of David and Mephibosheth? And it isn't that the name is too hard to pronounce. I think it's because when it comes to stories, we tend to be more drawn to competition and domination. We're drawn to someone beating someone else at something. We're drawn to a story where someone wins. But stories of honoring deep friendship and keeping promises, those are a little harder to sell. Goliath is simply going to pack more in at the box office than Mephibosheth. Can you see David and Mephibosheth on the marquee at the venue down the street? The story, though, does need the larger context, and that is full of more juicy things. It's full of jealousy and war and death and comparison and competition and domination, and a deep love that pierces all of that. So I offer you a story greatly summarized. David was the son of Jesse of the tribe of Judah. Jonathan was the son of Saul, who was the king of Israel of the tribe of Benjamin. We'll just say that Saul began having some trouble as king, and a very important person known as the prophet Samuel told Saul that God had decided he didn't need to be king anymore. So Samuel goes to visit Jesse to see if one of his many sons might just be the next king. And to everyone's surprise, the one that Samuel chooses to anoint is the smallest of them all, a little shepherd boy, a guy named David. Now, not long after that happened, the Israelites were continuing their battle with the Philistines, and the Philistines had a special weapon of mass destruction, a giant named Goliath. And this part David was the only Israelite willing to go up against Goliath, who he easily defeated with a slingshot. It's the ultimate underdog story. So Saul, who was still king at this point, wasn't even sure who this David guy was, but when he learned that Samuel had anointed him to be the king, he plotted to try and kill David. But Jonathan was Saul's son, and he felt a kinship with David from the moment that they met. And we're told that his soul knit to the soul of David, and that he loved him like he loved himself. The language is absolutely beautiful about this. So Jonathan could have challenged David for the throne, but instead, he literally gave him all of his armor and his military clothes. He just took them off and gave them to him, to literally and symbolically show that he was giving up any right that he would have to challenge David for the throne. He fully accepted that David was the successor and not him. And you get the sense from the text that for Jonathan, this was done with joy and not any sense of begrudgingness. Saul, though, was not like his son in this way, and he continued to pursue David. David rightly feared for his life. When he shared this with Jonathan, Jonathan said, let me feel out my dad about this. If he intends you no harm, then I will let you know that. If he intends you harm, I will let you know that. But I have to say, said Jonathan, if my father plans to harm you, then may the Lord do even more so with me, Jonathan." So they made a covenant with one another. David promised not to hurt Jonathan or any of his descendants if he became king. Even if all the other enemies had been wiped out, he promised to protect his friend's family. And then there was a close call with Saul, who was so angry at Jonathan for protecting David that Jonathan became concerned for his own safety. Jonathan got word to David that he should go and not come back until he knew it was safe to do so. And this was their final parting scene. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" And they never saw each other again. Sadly, Jonathan and his brothers were killed in a battle not long after this. And Jonathan at the time, and we know this through a Midrash text, Jonathan at the time had a 5-year-old son, Mephibosheth, who was being watched by his nurse. She had him in her arms while she was fleeing the violence, and she dropped him, and she injured his feet, and he was never able to walk again. And Saul, in his despair from losing all of his sons at once, took his own life. Enter David as king. So I promised you a little drama, right? And friends, Game of Thrones ain't got nothing on the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. It is not for the faint of heart. The story continues, though. Time passes. David is busy being king. He had a good number of successes, a number of feathers in his cap. Bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem wasn't too shabby. And in the midst of these triumphs, though, he still misses his friend Jonathan deeply. And that's where today's part of the story comes in, with David's deeply grief-filled question: is there still anyone in the house of Saul that I may show kindness to for the sake of Jonathan? Now, David had every single right as king to do one of two things. He could exile any descendants of a potential heir to the throne, or he could have them all killed. This would have been very much his right to do as the new king. It would have been common practice. So when Mephibosheth was brought to David's house, the poor guy assumed it was probably his end. He might have been able to serve David as a servant. He could have maybe wagered that, but because of his disability, because of the fact that he couldn't walk, he wasn't able to even be a servant. In this culture and at this time, he had nothing to bring to the table to make himself of any practical worth to David. Mephibosheth essentially could add nothing to David's bottom line, except perhaps love. He was adopted that day. He spent the rest of his days sitting at David's table as a son. Not only that, David restored to him and his family all of Saul's fortunes. All that David now rightfully owned, he gave back, all because of his love for Jonathan and to honor the covenant that they made together. Whew. So tell me, do you think that this can become as well known as the Goliath story? Will you join me in this effort to make this more well known? Here's a difference, though. When we meet David here, he is clearly no longer the underdog. He has all the power. He was very early in his reign. He was very popular. And he chose at this moment not to use his power to dominate. He chose not to have the final win over Saul, who had been such a rival. He chose instead the power of relationship and loyalty. He chose in this moment the power of his own honor and integrity. He chose to do something, to act on all the love that he still had for Jonathan. And now let's be honest for a minute about David. He made plenty of choices that weren't so great. The guy wore his heart on his sleeve for both good and not so good. But in making this choice for Mephibosheth, David also made a choice against two things that we can all relate to that are at the heart of the human problem today: comparison and competition. If he had been more insecure, He could have needed one more mark on his side of the David-Saul columns, comparing his might to that of his predecessor. If he needed one more mark in his column, he could have done away with Mephibosheth altogether, and no one would have thought a thing of it. But the power of love and loyalty were bigger than whatever his ego needs might have been at that time. And maybe it was because David had known deep love through his friendship with Jonathan that he was able to make this choice. Like all deep love, it can help us experience and accept the eternal and unalterable love that is available to all of us, and that is the love of God, just as we are. If we know we are loved, despite of, or maybe even because of our shortcomings, then we have less of a need to compare. We have less of a need to compete, however subconsciously. Maybe it was because David knew the power of relationship. The power with one another is so much stronger than the power over one another. I referred to ego in both the title and in the text of the sermon, and I just want to say a word about what I mean by that. When I say ego, I mean whatever we think makes us who we are. It's things like accomplishments and titles and connections and status, etc., etc., etc. Things that in and of themselves are not necessarily bad, but when we let them define us, we give them our power. We mistake them for who we are, our ego. And we keep them in place through competition and comparison. But letting our real and deeper self emerge more and more is the whole point of the spiritual journey of our lives, and relationships are an integral part of helping our real selves to emerge. Not only did David have a choice here, but so did Mephibosheth. He too had to choose to trust David and to trust that he was worthy of a place at the table just as he was. He had to trust that he did not need to do anything to earn or to keep it, that it just was. I wonder if sometimes that's actually the hardest thing for us to accept, that we too have a place at the table, that we have a place that we neither have to earn or compete for. Sometimes we are Mephibosheth, and that is the work that is ours to do, to simply say yes, thank you. And sometimes we are more like David and need to ask, who is my Mephibosheth today? Who is this in my life? Whose life can I make better today in even very simple ways? These things go a long way towards learning to cherish one another, and they can get us out of our comfort zone. And a little secret, it's only out of our comfort zone that we ever grow. So I ask you, who is your Mephibosheth today? Who do you know that might need that note of encouragement? Who usually sits alone that you might invite to sit with you or go ask if you might sit beside them? Who might need a place at your Thanksgiving table this year? You might think to yourself, those are nice, but those things don't change the world. I offer you a story that suggests otherwise.